Let me start with something that sounds like a metaphor. Blue blood. Sangre azul. The phrase travels across at least a dozen languages, on at least 5 continents, used to describe the same class of people. Rulers, priests, the anointed, the chosen, those who sit above the mechanisms of ordinary civilization and pull quietly at the levers the rest of us cannot see. We are told it's a metaphor. We are told it means noble lineage, aristocratic heritage, the right family name written into the right ledger at the right moment in history. But what if it isn't a metaphor at all? What if for the entirety of recorded history, a certain class of rulers have been described consistently, repeatedly, across cultures that supposedly never spoke to one another as possessing blood that was literally, physiologically, observably different? That is the question I started with. A small question, it seemed, a curious one. The deeper I looked, the less small it became. The word aristocrat in its oldest Greek form doesn't mean wealthy. It doesn't mean powerful. It means best-blooded. The assumption buried inside the language itself is that the rulers are made of something different, not better educated, not more strategically positioned, differently constituted. This is where I want you to pause, because we have been trained carefully, I would argue, to interpret that kind of language as pure symbolism, as the self-flattering mythology of ruling classes who needed stories to justify their thrones. But symbolism doesn't explain the consistency. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision across every civilization we've studied in any depth. The pharaohs of Egypt were described in temple records as possessing a divine car, a life force distinct from ordinary humans, and their bloodlines were tracked with obsessive bureaucratic precision across centuries. The early Chinese emperors were said to descend from dragons, a word whose oldest pictographic root does not mean serpent in the way we assume, but rather references a class of beings whose nature was different. The Sumerian king list, one of the oldest documents in human possession, casually records pre-flood kings reigning for tens of thousands of years, then notes that after the flood, the kingship descended from heaven again. Not rose from among the people, not emerged from conflict or election, descended. That specific word, that specific direction. Here's where it gets harder to ignore. The Nephilim. Most people who have encountered this word know it from a single religious text, and most have been taught to interpret it as allegory, a literary device, a moral warning, nothing more. But the Nephilim appear under different names with remarkably similar descriptions across texts and traditions that have no documented contact with one another. In the Hebrew texts, they are the offspring of the Bene Ha-Elohim, literally, the sons of God who took human wives and produced a hybrid lineage, a different kind of being, giants in some translations, heroes of old, men of renown in others. In the Sumerian texts, the Apkallu, 7 sages of divine origin, interbreed with human royalty and establish the first civilization, the first kingship, the first system of law. They are depicted in stone reliefs as winged beings carrying a particular sacred object standing before the tree of life. Their physical descriptions are not human. In the traditions of the Andean civilizations, the first rulers of Tiwanaku are described as a race of beings who came before the Inca, taller, pale-skinned, with distinctive features, who then vanished or merged or were driven out, depending on which version of the oral tradition you follow. This raises a simple but critical question. Why does every ancient civilization on Earth have a version of the same story? Why does every origin of kingship narrative contain, somewhere in its earliest layers, a reference to rulers who are not entirely human? The official explanation, cultural diffusion, shared mythological archetypes, the universal human desire for divine authority, begins to collapse here, because diffusion requires contact, and the timelines don't allow for it. If you've been following this series, you already know the name Tartaria, and if you're new here, welcome. Stay with me. The great Tartary of historical maps, the vast civilization that covered an enormous swath of the Eurasian continent, documented on cartographic records from the 16th through 18th centuries, and then largely absent from academic conversation thereafter, presents us with a problem that conventional history has never satisfactorily resolved. Not an absence of evidence, not a lack of documentation, a rupture. Something ends, something is replaced, and the replacement arrives worldwide, curiously, with almost no transition period. No messy intermediate stage where old systems mix with new ones. Just before and after. The old world and the new one, separated by what official history describes as a series of revolutions, wars, plagues, and reforms that somehow, conveniently, reset the entire planetary system of governance, commerce, record-keeping, and, perhaps most significantly, genealogy. The ruling bloodlines do not disappear in this transition. They re-emerge, clarified, documented from a new starting point, with elaborate new genealogies that reach backward with suspicious neatness and forward into the institutions we now recognize as modern governance. The deeper I went into the genealogical records, the stranger it became. Let's talk about the physical, because this is where the conversation usually stops, where the polite researchers put down the thread and step away, where the documentary gets labelled and shelved, but the physical evidence is there, if you're willing to look at it without the framework you've been given. Royal portraiture across European dynasties painted over 4 centuries by artists who competed fiercely for accuracy and patronage contains a series of recurring physical anomalies, elongated skulls. Not the extreme examples that get circulated as obvious forgeries or curiosities, but subtle, consistent cranial proportions that differ measurably from the general population depicted in the same paintings. You can see it most clearly when you look at the children. Royal children painted in the same frames as servants, courtiers, or common subjects show a proportional distinction that painters of the period trained obsessively in life drawing would have no reason to falsify. These were not flattering distortions. The flatteries of portraiture were elsewhere: the posture, the costume, the symbolic objects. The skull shape was simply observed and rendered. This raises a simple but critical question. Why does this pattern appear in the portraiture of ruling families across cultures that had no contact with one another? Why do we see similar cranial elongation in the funerary art of Egyptian nobility, in the sculpted portraits of Paracus rulers, in the carved depictions of the earliest Sumerian kings? The official explanation, artistic convention, symbolic representation of divine status, breaks here. Because artists in these cultures were not copying one another. They were drawing what they saw, or they were drawing what they were told to draw, which is an even stranger answer. Now, the blood itself. Blue blood, literally, is not impossible. It is not science fiction. It is not allegory. Copper-based blood, hemocyanin in its various forms, is real. It exists in the animal kingdom. It appears blue or blue-green when oxygenated, rather than the iron-based red of human hemoglobin. It is associated in the creatures that possess it with certain physiological capacities that differ from iron-blooded organisms. I am not a scientist. I am not making a biological claim here, but I am asking a question. If the rulers of the ancient world and the pre-flood civilizations described in texts from every corner of the earth were of a different kind, why do we assume their biochemistry was identical to ours? And here's the strangest part. The phrase blue blood appears in European nobility culture at a moment that is historically immediately post-Tartaria. The Spanish term sangre azul emerges in the Castilian nobility in the period following the great resets of the late medieval and early modern era. It's presented as a metaphor, a way of distinguishing those whose skin was pale enough to show the blue veins underneath, unmarked by the sun's labour. That is the official explanation. But that explanation requires us to believe that an entire continent's ruling class adopted a phrase describing visible blue veins in the skin, without anyone remarking that this was a strange way to describe lineage. Skin transparency is not heritable in the way the phrase implies. You cannot reliably pass down the appearance of visible veins as a genetic trait that precisely tracks your membership in a ruling bloodline, unless what was being described was not vein visibility, unless what was being described was something in the blood itself. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The medieval texts that describe royal ceremonies, particularly the anointing ceremonies, the coronations, the rituals of succession, include physical examinations of the heir, not just medical examinations in the modern sense, ritual examinations carried out by specific priestly or scholarly classes who were, and this is documented, sworn to secrecy about what they observed. What were they observing? We don't know. The records of those examinations, where they existed, are among the most thoroughly lost documents of the pre-modern era. Not accidentally lost, not destroyed by fire or flood in the ordinary way of things. Gone. In the archives I was able to access, the absence itself is documented. You can find records of records, indices of documents that once existed, references in secondary text to primary sources that cannot now be located. This is unusual. Most historical losses are random. Fire destroys a whole archive, not a specific category of documents within it. War scatters collections indiscriminately. But the specific class of documents that describe the physical characteristics of royal heirs, the succession examinations, the bloodline verifications, these show a pattern of targeted absence that is, once you see it, impossible to explain as coincidence. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Consider the world-spanning coordination problem. This is the piece that the official narrative simply cannot answer. Not around one civilization, not around two, around every major ruling structure on Earth simultaneously, in the same narrow historical window, we see the same phenomenon. A reset of genealogical records, a reconstruction of bloodline documentation, a new official narrative about the origins of the ruling class that references backward into conveniently undocumented antiquity, but begins its reliable documentation at approximately the same period. 17th century, 18th century. Not in Europe alone, in the reorganized empires of Asia, in the newly established colonial governance structures of the Americas, in the restructured sultanates and caliphates of the Middle East and North Africa. Everywhere, the documented genealogy of the ruling class has a similar horizon. This is the coordination problem. We are asked to believe that across these widely separated, supposedly unconnected civilizations, the same genealogical reset happened independently, for independent reasons, in the same historical window, producing the same documentary gap and resulting in the same class of rulers emerging from the rubble with new papers and old claims. The evidence suggests something much larger was being managed, not why, not when, not under which formal decree, not the mechanisms of ordinary historical change. How? How do you coordinate the simultaneous reconstruction of ruling legitimacy across an entire planet? You coordinate it if you have a network old enough and organized enough and motivated enough to execute a world-spanning project of historical replacement. And that raises its own question, because a network capable of that is not the network of any government or army we know of. It is the network of a bloodline with something to protect. Here is what the Tartaria research, combined with the bloodline anomalies, appears to suggest. I say appears to suggest carefully. I am not making a claim. I am following a thread. The civilization we have labelled Tartaria, or rather the civilizations that the European cartographers of the 16th and 17th centuries labelled under that umbrella, may have represented something other than what the dismissive academic consensus describes. not a medieval backwater, not a collection of nomadic cultures being euphemistically mapped. Something organized, something architecturally sophisticated, something with a ruling structure whose physical characteristics were, in the records that have survived, described in ways that don't map onto ordinary human biology. The Tartarian rulers in the fragmentary accounts that do survive, in the travel literature, the trade records, the missionary documents that were later heavily edited or recalled, are described with a consistency that is, once you notice it, difficult to dismiss. Height outside the ordinary range. Features described as neither European nor Asian in the familiar modern sense, but something that occupies a category those writers seem to reach for and not quite find the vocabulary to describe. And the blood. There are references, obscure ones, buried in footnotes, in secondary sources, in documents that have not been digitized and do not appear in any searchable academic database, to the physical examination of Tartarian lineage rulers that mirror exactly the examination rituals of European nobility. The same ritual, the same sworn secrecy, the same gap in the documentary record afterward. And that's where the silence becomes impossible to ignore, because the silence is not uniform. The silence is not the silence of information that was never recorded. It is the silence of information that was recorded and then systematically, repeatedly, across multiple archives on multiple continents, removed. This is a different kind of silence. This is the silence of decision. Someone or some network of someone's across 2 centuries of historical management made a decision about what the ruling classes of the modern world would be permitted to know about their own predecessors. Made a decision about what the rest of us, the governed, the documented, the reliably ordinary, would be permitted to know about the people who governed us. And they were thorough. They were extraordinarily, exhaustingly thorough. The silence was deafening. Once I knew to listen for it. I want to leave you with a question. Several questions, actually. Because I'm not here to give you answers. I'm here to show you the shape of what's missing. If the phrase blue blood is purely metaphorical, why does it appear independently across cultures at the same historical moment that genealogical records undergo their great reset? If the physical anomalies in royal portraiture are purely artistic convention, why do artists across cultures with no contact produce the same conventions in the same specific relationship to the same specific subjects? If the Nephilim narratives are purely symbolic, why does every civilization on Earth have one? And why do they all describe the same thing? Beings of a different kind, establishing kingship, establishing law, establishing the distinction between ruler and ruled, in the same direction, with the same result. If the Tartarian civilization was a minor historical footnote, why does its deliberate erasure from the academic record require so much ongoing, apparently coordinated effort to maintain? And if the bloodlines that emerge from the Great Reset of the 17th and 18th centuries are simply the bloodlines of fortunate families, why does their documentation contain the same gaps, the same silences, the same missing examination records as the bloodlines that came before them? The official explanation collapses here, not under the weight of any single anomaly, under the weight of all of them together. The Nephilim accounts, the elongated portraiture, the missing examination records, the Tartarian erasure, the simultaneous genealogical reset, the blue blood phrase appearing at exactly the wrong historical moment for coincidence. Not one, not two, not 3 anomalies, but the entire pattern, repeating across centuries and continents, pointing in the same direction, towards something older than the civilization we think we live inside, towards something that decided at some point that we didn't need to know what it was. We don't know what they found in those examinations. We don't know what made the bloodline verifiers swear silence. We don't know what the cartographers saw when they labelled those vast territories and sent their records back to chancelleries that then, quietly, began the work of rewriting them. We don't know if blue blood was a metaphor that was always true, or a truth that was dressed as a metaphor. We don't know what was lost, but we know something was hidden. We know the hiding was deliberate, and we know, because once you see it, you can't unsee it, that the shape of what's missing is not random. It has edges. It has a consistent outline. It points toward a specific kind of question about a specific kind of people who held a specific kind of power for a very long time, and who needed, at a very specific moment in history, for the rest of us to stop asking what kind of people they actually were. I'll be continuing this research. The thread goes deeper. It always does.